In this whiteboard, we will focus on the first lesson about the importance of domain definitions, which are clear as the basis for instrument selection for all types of instruments. The other two lessons will be covered in separate whiteboards. We will use an example from psoriatic arthritis to illustrate the lesson on the importance of domain definitions, which are easily understandable. Here is the psoriatic arthritis OMERACT onion. As you can see, the measurement of peripheral joint disease activity, including inflammation, is mandatory in all trials. Inflammation can be measured in different ways: by physical examination or a patient report focus on swollen joints, by an increase in the number of specific cells in a blood sample, or by an imaging technique such as a diagnostic ultrasound of a joint. For imaging, we need a way of clearly describing what type of inflammation we wish to measure, and then to verify that the imaging machine that we choose will provide an image that is indeed able to measure the domain of inflammation. We have developed a template that we call the boxes approach to help think through how to produce a definition of a domain that is clear. The boxes approach template is a series of descriptions which provide an increasing level of detail as we progress through them. This can then be used to assess whether a potential instrument is a good match for measuring the domain of interest. The process of defining a domain can be summarized as providing clear and agreed definitions of a broad domain. This clarifies what we want to measure within one of the OMERACT core areas. A target domain. This specifies what we want to focus on by describing which body structures or processes should be measured. And the domain components, also known as the elementary components. This identifies the parts of the body, processes or structures that can actually be measured. We will now walk through an example of the boxes approach. Jane has psoriatic arthritis and is a participant in a research study for a new drug to help reduce inflammation. The researchers need to know whether ultrasound and an associated scoring system is a good instrument to measure inflammation of the knee joint. Using the boxes approach to domain definitions is the first step to knowing whether an ultrasound scoring system is indeed able to see the inflammation, or stated differently, is a good match for the target domain. First, we define into which of the four OMERACT core areas the broad domain fits. In this case, it is manifestations abnormalities. Next, we define the broad domain. This describes what we want to measure, inflammation in this example. Now we need to be more specific about what type of inflammation we want to focus on. This is the target domain, and in this example, we want to focus on synovitis, which is inflammation of the synovial membrane of the joint. The synovial membrane is the layer of connective tissue like cling wrap that covers the inside of a joint, such as the knee. Next, we define the domain components to describe what we can actually measure. We use the term elementary components to label the parts of the process or structure that can actually be measured. In this example, we are interested in the elementary components of synovitis. Now that we have the domain perspective defined, we can move on to thinking about the definitions from the perspective of the imaging technique we are considering using, ultrasound in this example, to measure the target domain of synovitis. The choice of the best imaging technique to measure the target domain requires verification that the technique is able to visualize the process or structure and detects enough target domain elementary components. Here we define the technique perspective in greater detail. In this example, we are interested in the imaging technique of ultrasound. We want to focus on synovitis detectable by ultrasound, and we need to describe the elementary components of synovitis that can actually be measured by ultrasound. Lastly, the choice of the imaging instrument requires verification that the instrument, so the scoring system, within the technique, in this case ultrasound, has valid and reliable definitions of the target domain and its elementary components. In this last step, we need clear and agreed upon definitions of two parts. First is the theoretical definition of the target domain. Here we describe what ultrasound can show us. In this case, thickening of the synovial membrane, and increased blood flow in the joint. And second, the operational definition describes the specifics of what can be seen in the image, in this case an increase or decrease Doppler or echo signal that is associated with an increase or decrease in blood flow. This example shows that by clearly defining how the ultrasound scoring system is able to measure inflammation in the knee joint, the researchers can assess whether the first step in OFISA, is there a match of the instrument with the target domain, has been met. The important lesson is that these domain definition box templates can be used to clearly define domains for all types of instruments in order to assess the domain match. For example, in the case of the broad domain of the impact of fatigue and rheumatoid arthritis, we can see whether a questionnaire on fatigue measures the target domain of impact of fatigue on daily activities. We will encourage all OMERACT working groups in the domain selection phase to use this boxes approach when defining their domains. This clear definition can then be used during the instrument selection phase to answer the first question in OFISA, is it a match with the target domain? We would like to acknowledge and thank the OMERACT Imaging Methods Group, Handbook Committee, and Technical Advisory Group for work on the development of OMERACT's methods and processes. Special thanks to the Patient Research Partners Task Force on Imaging for their input to create materials for the sharing and dissemination of this work.